The year was 1879, and the world for Caleb Weston had shrunk to the size of his grief. It was a patch of hard scrabble land clawed from the Texas plains, a place where the wind was the only constant companion and the silence was so profound it had weight. His cabin, a relic of some forgotten homesteader's optimism, sagged under the unforgiving sun, its timbers silvered and split like old bones. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of laughter and the lingering scent of a life that was no longer his. A small, smoothed-down rocking horse sat in one corner, shrouded in dust and stillness, a monument to a future that had died with his wife Martha and their boy, Thomas, swept away by the fever 2 winters past. Caleb's days fell into a rhythm of pure survival, a litany of chores that kept his hands busy and his mind blessedly numb. He moved through his life like a man in a dream, his face a mask of stoic indifference carved by loss. He checked his trap lines, mended fences that protected nothing of value, and stared out at the horizon where the sky bled into the bruised earth. He was a man hollowed out, the vital parts of him scooped away, leaving only the shell to carry on. He didn't live on the land. He merely existed upon it, waiting for a finality that was taking its sweet time. It was on a day like any other, under a sky the color of faded denim, that the rhythm broke. He was down by the creek that snaked through the southern edge of his property, its water a muddy trickle after weeks without rain. He'd been checking for tracks, for anything that might promise a meager meal when he saw it. A splash of color against the dun-colored bank, a smear of deep crimson that did not belong. His first thought was a wounded deer, but as he drew closer, his hand resting on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip, the shape resolved itself into something else entirely. It was a woman. She was lying face down, half in the shallow water, her dark hair fanned out like a spill of ink. Her buckskin dress, intricately decorated with beadwork he'd never seen the like of, was torn and stained with mud and blood. A deep, wicked-looking gash marred her side, the flesh around it puckered and angry. She was Comanche, or Kiowa, he couldn't be sure. It didn't matter. To the settlers further east, she was trouble, a danger, a piece of the wildness they sought to tame or eradicate. Every instinct, honed by years of frontier caution and bitter stories, screamed at him to turn around, to walk away and pretend he had seen nothing. Leaving her was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. He stood there for a long moment, the dry wind whispering through the brittle reeds, a sound like 1,000 tiny sighs. He saw the delicate turn of her wrist, the slimness of her form, and something stirred in the cavern of his chest. It was a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who had held his wife's hand and promised her a world of safety, the man who had lifted his son onto his shoulders to see the endless sky. He thought of Martha, her body racked with fever, her life seeping away while he stood helpless. He had been unable to save his own. Cursing himself, the world, and whatever God had forsaken him, Caleb knelt. With a grunt of effort that was more spiritual than physical, he gathered the unconscious woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail, and as he lifted her, a low moan escaped her lips. The sound, faint as it was the first sign of life he had truly acknowledged in 2 years. He had just brought the greatest complication imaginable into the heart of his desolate peace. He carried her back to the cabin, his boots kicking up dust that swirled around them in a hazy shroud. The journey felt impossibly long, each step a repudiation of the quiet emptiness he had cultivated. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft surface in the entire dwelling, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the confounding reality of her presence. A native woman, wounded and unconscious, lay in his bed. The silence of the room was now charged with a new kind of tension, a living, breathing pulse of uncertainty. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resolve, he went to work. He fetched water from the rain barrel and tore strips from one of Martha's old linen sheets, a sacrilege that sent a sharp pang through him. His hands, usually steady when mending a harness or skinning a rabbit, felt clumsy and large as he gently cleaned the wound on her side. It was deep, a slice from a knife, or perhaps a glancing blow from an arrowhead. It was infected, the skin around it hot to the touch. He did what he could, washing it with boiled water and applying a poultice of yarrow he'd learned about from an old trapper, his movements hesitant and unsure. He had tended livestock, but never a person in this way, not since he pushed the thought away before it could fully form. For 3 days she drifted in a fevered haze. Caleb sat by the cot, a silent, grim-faced guardian. He forced cool water between her cracked lips and changed the dressing on her wound, watching for any sign of change. He found himself studying her face in the dim, shifting light of the cabin. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a proud, firm jaw, even in unconsciousness. The intricate patterns of the beads on her dress spoke of patience and artistry, a world of meaning he could not comprehend. He was tending to a complete stranger, a woman who would likely see him as an enemy if she were awake, yet he felt a strange, unwelcome sense of responsibility settle over him like a heavy wool blanket. On the 4th morning, he awoke to find her eyes open. They were dark and bottomless, and they were fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. There was no fear in them, not at first. There was only a sharp, intelligent appraisal, a sizing up of the man and the situation. He sat frozen on his stool across the small room, the tin cup of coffee halfway to his lips. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated suspicion. He slowly lowered his cup and made a simple, open-handed gesture meant to convey peace. Her gaze didn't soften. It flickered to the door, to the rifle leaning against the wall, then back to him. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of threat and opportunity. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp of pain cutting the movement short as the wound in her side pulled. She fell back against the pillow, her jaw tightening. Caleb rose slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He ladled some thin broth from the pot, simmering over the fire, into a bowl. He approached the cot as one would a wary wolf. He held out the bowl. She stared at it, then at him, her eyes narrowed. He simply stood there, offering it, waiting. After a long, tense minute, her gaze dropped to the bowl again. With a slow, reluctant movement, she reached out a hand and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and the brief contact was like a spark of static electricity in the dead air. She drank the broth, never taking her eyes off him, a prisoner accepting rations from her jailer. Thus began their strange, silent cohabitation. They did not speak, for they had no shared words. Their communication was a sparse, elemental language of gesture and observation. A nod of his head toward the water bucket, a faint inclination of hers to accept a piece of bread. He went about his chores, always conscious of her presence, of her dark eyes, following his every move. When she was strong enough to leave the cot, she would sit in the chair by the hearth, her back straight, her hands occupied with repairing the torn beadwork on a leather pouch she'd had with her. The rhythmic, patient work of her needle seemed a quiet act of defiance, a reclamation of her identity in this alien place. Caleb found himself watching her, too. He observed the way she moved, with a fluid grace that returned as her strength did. He saw the subtle shifts in her expression, a tightening of her lips when a coyote howled too close, a far-off look in her eyes as she stared into the flames. He began to see not an Indian, not a Comanche, but a woman who was healing, who was resilient, and who was as utterly alone in the world as he was. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Caleb was checking the shutters when a particularly loud clap of thunder made him jump. A small, involuntary sound escaped him. When he turned, he saw her watching him, and for the first time there was something other than suspicion in her eyes. It looked almost like understanding. He felt a flush of embarrassment and turned away, busying himself with the fire. Later that night, he was running a hand over the dusty rocking horse in the corner, his back to her. The grief, always lurking just beneath the surface, ambushed him in the storm-charged quiet. His shoulders slumped, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled for a moment. He did not realize he was crying, not until he felt a light touch on his arm. He spun around, startled. She stood there, her face softened in the firelight, her eyes holding a deep and sorrowful wisdom. She looked from him to the little horse, and her expression was one of profound empathy. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. In that single, silent gesture, she had seen the core of his pain. She had seen the ghosts that haunted the cabin and the man who lived within it. From that night on, the quality of the silence between them changed. It was no longer a void of mistrust, but a shared space of quiet companionship. The tension eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. He started leaving wildflowers on the table for her, small bunches of purple verbena and Indian paintbrush he found on his walks. He didn't know why he did it. He just knew that the splash of color against the drab wood of the cabin felt right. In return, she began to teach him. She would point to the water bucket and say a word, a soft, flowing sound. Pa. He would repeat it, his own voice clumsy and rough. Pa. She would give a small, approving nod. Fire was kutsu, rabbit was tavo. Each word was a thread, weaving a delicate bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. He learned her name was Winona. Her healing progressed. The angry gash on her side slowly closed, leaving a puckered silver scar. She began to help with small tasks, her movements efficient and sure. She showed him how to set better snares, how to read the subtle signs of the land he had lived on but never truly seen. He, in turn, showed her how to work the small hand-cranked grinder for the corn, an object that seemed to fascinate her. They would sometimes share a small smile over a misspoken word or a clumsy gesture. Laughter was still a foreign currency, but a gentle amusement began to bloom in the spaces between them. Caleb felt a thawing inside him, a slow, aching return of feeling to limbs long frozen. He was still a man defined by what he had lost, but Winona's presence had become a quiet anchor in his drifting existence. She was a reason to stoke the fire, to hunt for more than just his own subsistence, to be present in the world. He had taken her in to save her life, but he was beginning to realize she was, in her own quiet way, saving his. The fragile peace they had built was shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the cabin, their silhouettes stark against the searing blue sky. They were not cowboys or homesteaders. They rode with the lazy arrogance of men who took what they wanted and feared no reprisal. Caleb's blood ran cold. He recognized the man in the lead, Garrett Donovan, a ruthless opportunist who led a band of ex-militia men and bounty hunters, vultures who preyed on the fringes of the territory. Inside, he said to Winona, the single word sharp with urgency. Don't make a sound. She saw the look on his face and disappeared into the shadows of the cabin without a word of protest, her movements swift and silent as a cat. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the sun, his posture deceptively relaxed, his hand never far from his sidearm. Donovan and his men rode down, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. They reined in before the cabin, their eyes sweeping over the poor homestead with undisguised contempt. Weston, Donovan greeted, a humorless smile twisting his lips. He was a big man with a florid face and pale, cold eyes. Still hiding out here with the lizards and the ghosts? Donovan, Caleb replied, his voice flat. What do you want? Just passing through, Donovan said, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. Heard some commotion out this way a few weeks back. A little skirmish. We were tracking a small party of Comanche renegades, lost one of them, a woman. He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his eyes narrowing. You ain't seen a stray squaw wandering about, have you? Wounded, maybe? Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his face a blank mask. Haven't seen anyone. Been just me out here. Donovan grunted, unconvinced. One of his men pointed a grimy finger toward the side of the cabin. What's that? Caleb's gaze followed. A small strip of the linen he had used for bandages had snagged on a nail near the rain barrel, fluttering in the breeze. It was a small thing, an insignificant detail, but in this tense standoff, it was as damning as a confession. "That's my business," Caleb said, his voice dropping low and hard. Donovan's smile widened. It was a predator's smile. "Is that so? We heard this particular squaw was important, that her daddy is some big chief. Important enough that there might be a handsome reward for her return, or for proof that she ain't coming back at all." He looked Caleb up and down. "A man living like this could use a reward, Weston." "I told you," Caleb repeated, his voice like flint. "There's no one here. You'd best be on your way." For a long moment, Donovan just stared at him, the silence thick with menace. Caleb did not flinch. He was no longer the hollowed-out man he had been. He was a man with something to protect. Finally, Donovan shrugged, a theatrical gesture of nonchalance. "All right, Weston. Have it your way." He wheeled his horse around. "But we ain't going far. If we find out you're lying to us, well, this little shack of yours burns real easy." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. Caleb watched them go, his hand clenched into a fist. The confrontation he had dreaded was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. He went back inside. Winona emerged from the shadows, her face grim. She had heard everything. Her eyes met his, and in that shared look, they were no longer a man and a woman from different worlds. They were allies, bound together by a common threat. The world he had tried to shut out had come for them both. The next day passed in a state of high alert. Caleb and Winona worked in near silence, but it was a new kind of silence, one of shared purpose and heightened senses. Every gust of wind, every distant bird call, sounded like the approach of riders. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and pistol, his movements precise and economical. She, in turn, found a hunting bow and a quiver of arrows he'd taken in trade long ago and forgotten in the small barn. She tested the string, her fingers moving with familiar grace, and began sharpening the arrowheads on a whetstone. The sight of her, so focused and capable, stirred a deep, protective instinct in him that was fierce and absolute. He had brought her in out of a reluctant flicker of decency, a ghost of the man he once was. Now, the thought of letting any harm come to her was unbearable. She had become more than a responsibility. She had become the center of his world, the force that had pulled him back from the precipice of despair. He was no longer just protecting her. He was defending the flicker of hope she had ignited within him. They knew Donovan would be back. It was not a question of if, but when. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Caleb saw movement on the ridge again. This time they weren't trying to be subtle. They rode down toward the cabin, fanning out, their intentions clear. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice low. He took up his position near the door, rifle in hand. The cabin, once his sanctuary of grief, had become a fortress. "Caleb," Winona said, her voice soft but firm. He turned. She held the bow in one hand, an arrow nocked in the other. Her eyes were blazing. She gestured toward the back window, which offered a line of sight to the side of the cabin. A silent question, an offer of alliance. He gave a single, sharp nod. They were in this together. The pounding on the door was heavy and splintering. "Weston, we know she's in there. Send her out, and we'll let you live." Donovan's voice was a drunken roar. Caleb remained silent, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. He was not giving her up. He would not. The world could go to hell. The flimsy wooden door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it. Then again. With a crack of splintering wood, the door flew open, and one of Donovan's men stumbled in, a pistol in his hand. Caleb didn't hesitate. His rifle roared, the sound deafening in the small space. The man crumpled to the floor. Chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the evening quiet. A bullet tore through the wall next to Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. He fired back through the doorway, forcing the others to take cover. He could hear Donovan shouting orders, his voice raw with fury. Suddenly, a scream of pain came from outside. to the right, a sharp, guttural cry. Caleb risked a glance. One of Donovan's men was on the ground, clutching his leg, an arrow protruding from his thigh. From the darkened back window, Winona had fired her first shot. Enraged, Donovan himself charged the doorway, firing wildly. Caleb ducked as bullets chewed up the wall behind him. He was pinned down. He could see Donovan reloading, preparing for another rush. It was over. He was out of time. Then, a flash of movement. Winona was no longer at the window. She had moved through the cabin as silently as a shadow. In her hand was the skinning knife from Caleb's belt, which he'd left on the table. As Donovan stepped through the door, his eyes fixed on Caleb, Winona surged from the side. She was not a princess, not a delicate flower. She was a warrior, her face a mask of cold fury, her entire being focused on a single point. She drove the knife into Donovan's side, under his arm, with a powerful upward thrust. The big man roared, a sound of shock and agony, his pistol discharging into the floor as he staggered back. His eyes, wide with disbelief, found hers. He tried to raise his gun, but his strength failed him. He collapsed in the doorway, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before slumping into stillness. The last man, seeing his leader fall and hearing his companion's cries, lost his nerve. He fired one last wild shot into the night, and then scrambled onto his horse, fleeing into the darkness as fast as the terrified animal could carry him. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the low moans of the man with the arrow in his leg. The cabin was a wreck, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Caleb looked at Winona. She stood over Donovan's body, the knife still in her hand, her chest heaving. Her eyes met his across the ruined space. The bond that had grown in silence, nurtured by small kindnesses, had just been forged anew in blood and fire. He had stood to protect her, and in the end, she had saved his life. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took the knife from her trembling hand, his fingers closing over hers. In the immediate aftermath, they moved with a grim, shared purpose. Caleb bound the wounded man's leg and, at dawn, sent him away on his horse with a stark warning never to return. They dragged Donovan's body and that of his companion far from the cabin and buried them in shallow, unmarked graves. There were no words for such work, only the grim necessity of it. Afterward, they returned to the cabin and began to set it right. He mended the broken door while she cleaned the floor, erasing the last physical traces of the violence. When the work was done, they sat together by the fire, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a deep, shared understanding. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the strength and courage that burned so brightly beneath her quiet exterior. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her side, the wound he had tended. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The words felt inadequate, a pebble tossed into a vast canyon of feeling. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she offered him a full, genuine smile. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. She placed her hand over his. "Caleb," she said, his name a soft melody on her tongue. It was all that needed to be said. In that moment, the ghosts in the cabin finally seemed to recede, and the little home felt less like a tomb and more like a beginning. A week later, a new group of riders appeared on the horizon. But these were different. They rode with a proud, disciplined grace, their bearing noble. There were more than 20 of them, their faces painted, their lances adorned with eagle feathers that danced in the wind. They were Comanche, and they rode as if they owned the land, because once they had. Caleb's hand went to his pistol, but Winona placed a calming hand on his arm. "My people," she said softly. They watched as the war party approached and halted a respectful distance from the cabin. One man, older than the rest, with a face like a weathered rock and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 moons, dismounted and walked forward alone. He was magnificent, his buckskin shirt covered in elaborate beadwork that put even Winona's to shame. He was clearly a man of immense authority. Winona stepped out to meet him, and Caleb followed, standing a few paces behind her. She spoke to the man in their tongue, her voice clear and strong. She spoke for a long time, her hands gesturing to the cabin, to Caleb, to the scar on her side. The older man listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, his gaze fell upon Caleb. It was a look that seemed to penetrate his very soul, weighing and measuring him. Caleb stood his ground, meeting the chief's gaze without aggression, without fear. He had done what was right. He had nothing to hide. The chief spoke to Winona, his voice a low rumble. She turned to Caleb. "This is my father, Wapasha," she said. "He is a great war chief of the Nokoni band. I have told him everything. I told him you found me when I was left for dead. I told him you tended my wound and gave me shelter. I told him you protected me from the men who attacked my escort and that you fought for me." Chief Wapasha took a step forward and spoke directly to Caleb in broken, heavily accented English. "You saved my daughter, my firstborn daughter. You are not like other white men." It was then that Caleb understood. The fine beadwork, the deference of her people, the bounty Donovan had spoken of. Winona was not just any woman. She was the daughter of a powerful Chifa princess, in the language of his world. He had harbored royalty in his humble, broken-down shack. Wapasha raised a hand, and one of his warriors led forward two stunning horses, a fiery Mustang and a gentle-looking mare, their saddles and bridles decorated with silver and turquoise. "A gift," Wapasha said, "for the life of my daughter." Caleb looked from the magnificent horses to Winona. Her eyes were full of a deep, sorrowful light. Her people had come. It was time for her to go home. The realization landed in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy. The fragile world they had built together was about to be dismantled. She walked back to him, her expression torn. "I must go, Caleb," she whispered. "They are my family. My life is with them." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump forming in his throat. He had known, of course, that she could not stay forever. But knowing it and living it were two very different things. He had just found his way back to the light, and now the light was leaving. "I understand," he finally managed to say. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small objector little bird he had whittled from a piece of scrapwood during the long, quiet evenings. It was crude, but the lines were smooth and graceful. He pressed it into her hand. "So you remember." Tears welled in her eyes. She clutched the bird tightly, and then, from around her neck, she removed a small, beaded pouch, the one she had so painstakingly repaired. "And you?" she said, pressing it into his hand. "So you do not forget." She turned and walked to her father, mounting the mare with a fluid grace. She looked back at him one last time, her gaze holding all the unspoken words, all the shared moments, all the quiet understanding. It held the terror of the storm, the warmth of the fire, the fury of the fight, and the gentle peace of their shared silence. Caleb Weston stood on the porch of his small cabin and watched as Winona, lost princess of the Comanche, rode away with her people, a proud, straight figure receding into the vast, indifferent landscape. He watched until they were just specks on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The silence that descended was profound, but it was different now. It was not the dead, empty silence of grief. It was a quiet filled with the echo of her presence, with the memory of her strength and the gift of her companionship. He opened his hand and looked at the beaded pouch, its intricate patterns a map of a world he had briefly touched. He had nursed a wounded stranger back to health, and in doing so, she had done the same for him. He was still alone, in his cabin on the edge of nowhere. But he was no longer a ghost. He had fought for something again. He had cared for someone again. The future was still an unknown country, but for the first time in a long, long time, he felt ready to face it. The wind whispered through the plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a promise.
Back in the dust and glare of the late 1880s, when the territory still felt vast and untamed, and the lines between settled land and wild country were drawn not just by fences but by suspicion. There lived a woman called Sahara. She belonged to the Apache people, though her life held her apart from many of her kin. Not by choice, entirely, but by circumstance and the quiet, heavy weight of years. She lived near the edge of the reservation lands, in a small, sturdy wickiup she had built herself, closer to the stark, sun-baked mesas than the clusters of other lodges. The land here was unforgiving, etched with dry washes and studded with cholla and prickly pear. It demanded respect and offered little comfort freely. Sahara knew it intimately. Her hands, though marked by sun and toil, moved with a practiced grace, gathering herbs that held forgotten remedies, tracking the scarce water sources, reading the signs the wind wrote in the sand. Sahara was, perhaps, 36 cycles of the moon, maybe 37. By the measure of some in her community, especially the older women who clung to tradition like a shield against the changing world, she had passed the time for first marriage. She had never married. There had been possibilities once, quiet glances from young men, but life had intervened. A sickness had claimed her parents and a younger sister when she was still a girl on the cusp of womanhood, leaving her alone, the responsibilities falling on her shoulders like stones. Then the world had shifted under the feet of her people, the wars, the forced moves, the shrinking lands. There had been no space for courtship, for building a future when the present was so precarious. Now, the quiet murmurings followed her like the dust devils on the plain. Too old, they whispered. Her path was meant to be another way. The spirits did not bless her with a husband or children when she was young. The words were not always cruel, but they were laced with a quiet finality, a resignation that she had missed her chance, that her life would be one of solitary independence, valued for her knowledge of the land and her skills, but not for the warmth of a family fire. Sahara heard the whispers, felt the distance they created. It settled deep inside her, a cold, still place. Grief was an old companion, a familiar weight she carried in her chest. The loss of her family, the loss of the life she might have had, the loss of belonging fully even amongst her own people. She filled her days with tasks, with the rhythm of the sun and the stars, with the silent company of the wind. She was resilient, yes, the land demanded it, but the resilience was a shield, not a source of warmth. Loneliness was a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of her solitude. Her life was a pattern, worn smooth by repetition and resignation. Miles away, across land that shimmered like a mirage in the heat, lived Caleb. He was 42 years old, a cowboy whose hands had long since lost the supple youth of his 20s, becoming calloused and strong, marked by rope burns and splinters. He wasn't a ranch owner of any size, just a man trying to scratch a living out of a small claim, a ramshackle cabin, and a few head of scrawny cattle. He'd drifted for years after the war, carrying scars that weren't all visible, trying to outrun memories that clung to him like the desert dust. Caleb was quiet to a fault, his face weathered into a landscape of its own, lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun and, perhaps, from sorrows he kept buried deep. He had known women, known companionship in passing, but nothing had ever taken root. He wasn't built for the easy sociability of towns or the complexities of settling down, not with the ghosts that rode his trail. He worked from sunup to sundown, his only companions the stubborn cattle, his weary horse, and the vast indifferent sky. Like Sahara, Caleb's life was defined by solitude, a self-imposed exile born of a weariness with the world and a quiet understanding that he didn't quite fit anywhere. He wasn't seeking anything, not really, just trying to exist, to make his small corner of the world manageable, to keep the past at bay through sheer physical exhaustion. His days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of chores and silence, punctuated only by the lowing of the herd or the distant howl of a coyote. He carried his own form of grief, a silent acknowledgement of paths not taken, lives lost, a future he no longer believed was possible for a man like him. He was resigned, stoic, and alone. The land stretched between them, harsh and beautiful, a fitting stage for lives lived on the edge, isolated by circumstance and choice. It held its breath under the relentless sun, waiting. It happened near the dry wash, a place where the earth had split open like a wound, revealing layers of time in its steep banks. Caleb was checking a fence line, a routine task in a routine day, when he saw a disturbance, a flicker of movement that wasn't animal. His hand went instinctively to the rifle in his saddle sheath. This land wasn't safe for anyone traveling alone, much less someone who appeared to be injured. He approached cautiously, the dry earth crunching under his boots. The figure was huddled against the side of the wash, partially concealed by scrub brush. As he got closer, his breath hitched. It was an Apache woman. His mind immediately flashed with warnings. The nearby town, their simmering resentment of anyone different, doubly so for the native people whose land they now occupied. To be found helping one. It wasn't just unpopular, it could be dangerous. But she was hurt, badly. A deep, ragged cut marred her leg, bleeding sluggishly into the dust. Her clothes were torn, her face pale under the tan, etched with pain. Her eyes, dark and sharp even in her weakened state, met his with a flicker of fear and defiance. Sahara. He knew her by sight, though they had never spoken. The quiet woman who lived alone near the mesas. He stayed mounted for a moment, the sun beating down, the silence pressing in. He could turn back, ride away, pretend he never saw her. It would be the safest thing, the sensible thing. But the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the stark reality of the wound, cut through his weariness, through the layers of self-preservation he had built over the years. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, meant to convey non-aggression. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Sahara watched him, her gaze intense, assessing. She didn't speak, didn't move, except for the slight tremble in her hands pressed against the earth. She was trapped, injured, and facing a white man, a representative of the people who had taken so much. Her instinct was to flee, to fight, but her body refused. "That cut needs tending," Caleb said, nodding towards her leg. "Can you ride?" She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The pain was a hot, throbbing fire. She had been running, trying to escape something or someone. She wasn't sure which, only that danger had felt close behind. She had fallen, twisted her leg, and the cut, likely from sharp rock, had opened. Now this man. Caleb knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. "My place isn't far. You can rest there. Get that cleaned up." He gestured vaguely back the way he'd come. His cabin was sparse, lonely, but it was shelter. It offered a measure of safety from whatever she was escaping, and from the elements. It was a problem he hadn't sought, a disruption to his carefully maintained solitude, but he couldn't leave her. The simple, undeniable need in front of him was a force he couldn't ignore. Her eyes searched his face, for deception, for malice, for something she could read. She saw weariness, caution, but also a quiet steadiness, a lack of the usual bluster or cruelty she had sometimes seen in men from the town. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. Getting her onto his horse was a difficult, painful process. Her leg was swollen, and the cut deep. Caleb worked with a quiet competence, his movements gentle but firm as he supported her weight, trying not to aggravate the injury. She grit her teeth, swallowing back cries of pain, her pride warring with her physical weakness. Finally, she was draped awkwardly across the saddle, Caleb leading the horse slowly back towards his cabin, a small, unlikely procession against the vast backdrop of the silent land. Her presence was a disruption, a challenge, a potential danger. It forced him out of the quiet resignation of his days and presented him with an immediate, undeniable responsibility. His life had changed in the space of a single discovery in a dry wash. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, smelling faintly of old wood smoke and dust. Inside it was Spartan, a narrow cot, a table, a chair, a small cast-iron stove, shelves with meager supplies. Caleb helped Sahara inside, easing her onto the cot near the stove. She was stiff with pain and mistrust, her body coiled like a wild animal ready to spring despite its injuries. Communication was minimal at first. Caleb fetched water from his well, heated some on the stove. He rummaged in a small tin and produced some clean rags and a bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He knelt by her leg, his face grim as he examined the wound. It was dirty, jagged. Infection was a real risk out here. "Gonna hurt," he warned, his gaze meeting hers briefly before focusing on the wound. He poured a generous amount of whiskey over the cut. Sahara gasped, a sharp intake of air, her hands clenching the rough wool blanket on the cot. She didn't cry out, though her body tensed, sweat beading on her forehead. Her silence was a form of defiance, a refusal to show weakness. He cleaned the wound carefully, gently, his large hands surprisingly deft. He bound it tightly with clean strips of cloth. All the while, their only exchange was functional, necessary. Drink some water. Need more light? Can you move it? Short questions, brief nods or shakes of the head. The silence between them was thick, not empty, but filled with unspoken questions, cautious observation, and the raw, vibrating tension of two strangers bound by circumstance in a confined space. Sahara watched him from under lowered lids. She saw the weary lines on his face, the careful way he handled her leg, the lack of cruelty in his eyes. He wasn't like the men in town who sometimes rode out, swaggering and full of bluster. He was quiet, contained, but he was still a white man. She had learned over many years that kindness from them was often fleeting or had a hidden cost. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Caleb, in turn, watched her. He saw her resilience, her fierce self-possession even in pain. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she observed everything, missed nothing. She was wary, yes, like a hawk on a fence post, ready to take flight at the slightest disturbance. He understood that wariness. He felt it himself, a constant companion born of a lifetime of expecting the worst. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was injured or what she was running from. Those questions felt too intrusive, too soon. He focused on the practicalities, keeping her safe, making sure the wound didn't fester, ensuring she had food and water. Their interaction was one of basic human need and reluctant provision, a silent truce forged in the shared necessity of survival. The days blurred into a slow rhythm dictated by the healing process. Sahara's fever spiked, and Caleb sat with her, sponging her forehead, giving her water. He brewed bitter tea from herbs he knew for fever, though he suspected her knowledge of such things far surpassed his own. When the fever broke, leaving her weak but clearer, she began to stir restlessly. "I can help," she murmured one morning, her voice raspy. It was the most she had said since arriving. Caleb looked up from mending a saddle strap. "Rest is the best help for now." She shook her head slightly. "Your fence, it needs work. I saw as you brought me. And the garden patch. The soil is tired." He hesitated. Her offer was unexpected. He was used to doing everything himself, but the fence did need work, more than he could get to alone, and his small garden struggled every year against the poor soil. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not just as an injured person or a source of potential trouble, but as someone with skills, with observations. "All right," he said finally. "When you're strong enough, but no rushing it." Slowly, carefully, Sahara began to move. First, hobbling outside on a makeshift crutch Caleb fashioned for her. She sat in the shade of the cabin, observing the land around them with an intense, knowing gaze. She pointed out plants he had ignored, telling him in her quiet, careful English what they were used for: medicine, food, dye. She showed him where the windbreak was weakest, where erosion was a threat. As she grew stronger, she insisted on doing small tasks. She weeded the struggling garden patch with a surprising ferocity, her fingers digging into the dry earth. She showed him how to mix ash into the soil, explaining it would replenish it. He watched her, fascinated by her connection to the land, a connection that went far deeper than his own practical efforts to tame it. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in fiery oranges and purples, they sat outside the cabin, sharing a meal of beans and salt pork. The silence was different now, less tense, more comfortable. "My leg is healing," she said, breaking the quiet. "I should go soon." The words hung in the air. Caleb felt a strange, unexpected pang. The routine of her presence, the quiet understanding that had grown between them without many words, had settled into him. He hadn't realized how much her company had begun to feel like a balm. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice low. "Back to the reservation?" She looked out at the horizon. "My place is there." "But," she trailed off. The silence spoke volumes, of the whispers, the isolation she faced even among her own. He nodded, understanding. "You can stay longer," he offered, "until you're fully healed. No need to rush into trouble, if that's what you were leaving." She looked at him then, her dark eyes steady. "Trouble finds me," she said simply. "Being who I am, being alone." That was the closest she had come to explaining. Alone, He knew that feeling. It was a language they both understood, spoken in the quiet spaces between them. He saw her not as an Apache woman, not as a problem, but as another soul navigating the relentless solitude of this world. He saw her strength, her quiet dignity, her deep well of knowledge. He saw past the judgments that others might place on her, the labels of outsider or too old. He simply saw Sahara. And perhaps she was beginning to see Caleb, the quiet man behind the weathered face, the unexpected kindness in his rough hands. Their shared experiences, born of necessity, were weaving a new pattern onto the worn fabric of their solitary lives. They weren't just coexisting, they were relying on each other, learning from each other, finding a quiet comfort in the shared rhythm of their days. The walls they had built around themselves, stone by stone, were beginning to show cracks, letting in the hesitant, fragile light of connection. The fragile peace they had found was not destined to last. The outside world, with its prejudices and fears, pressed in on their small, isolated haven. Word carried on the wind, or perhaps by a passing rider who had spotted smoke from Caleb's chimney and seen a figure that wasn't his, reached the nearby town. Rumors, like wildfire, spread quickly through the dusty streets. Caleb was harboring an Apache woman. The reaction was swift and ugly. The town, small and struggling, clung to its fears and resentments like a drowning man to driftwood. The Apache people were seen as a threat, as others, as less than. Any association with them was viewed with deep suspicion, especially by men like Brody, the self-appointed moral compass and loudest voice in the town saloon. Brody had lost a brother in a skirmish years ago, and nursed a bitter hatred that colored his every word and action concerning the native population. One afternoon, as Caleb and Sahara were working near the corral, mending a broken rail, 3 riders approached the cabin. Brody was at the front, flanked by 2 other men from town, their faces set in grim, self-righteous expressions. They pulled their horses to a stop, a respectful distance away, but their postures were aggressive, hands resting near rifle butts. Caleb straightened, dropping the hammer. Sahara moved instinctively closer to the cabin wall, her body language shifting back to the wary alertness of a cornered animal. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "Calloway," Brody yelled, using Caleb's last name, a name Caleb rarely heard spoken. "We need a word." Caleb walked slowly towards them, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stopped several yards away, forcing Brody to raise his voice if he wanted to be heard. "Afternoon, Brody. What is it?" "We hear you got company out here," Brody said, his eyes darting towards the cabin where Sahara stood, partially visible in the shadow. His voice was laced with accusation. "Got an injured traveler," Caleb replied evenly. "Woman needed help, I gave it." Brody scoffed. "An injured traveler? We hear it's an Apache woman, one of them." He spat the word out as if it tasted foul. "Ain't right, Calloway. Having one of them this close to town, too dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Caleb said, his voice tightening. "She's hurt, healing." "Don't matter," Brody sneered. "This is our land now. We don't want no Apache living among us. Get rid of her." Sahara stepped fully into view then, standing tall despite her still healing leg, her gaze level and unwavering as she looked at the men on horseback. Her presence seemed to fuel Brody's anger. "See," Brody exclaimed, gesturing wildly. "Defiant one, ain't she? Probably a spy. Or worse. You don't know what they're capable of, Calloway. Get her gone. By tomorrow, or we'll come back and do it for you." The threat hung heavy in the hot, still air. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach, quickly replaced by a heat he hadn't felt in years, protective anger. They weren't just threatening him, they were threatening Sahara, threatening the quiet, fragile connection they had found. "She's staying," Caleb said, his voice low but firm, leaving no room for argument. "She's not harming anyone. This is my land. You got no right to tell me who can be on it." Brody's face darkened. "We got every right when it's about the safety of the town." "You're making a mistake, Calloway, a big one. You got till sunrise tomorrow." With a final hostile glare, Brody reined his horse around and spurred it, his companions following suit. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Caleb and Sahara standing in the silence, the threat hanging heavy between them. Sahara walked slowly to Caleb's side. "They will come back," she stated, not a question. "Aye," Caleb agreed, his gaze fixed on the disappearing riders. "They will." The conflict had escalated. It was no longer just about an injured woman needing shelter. It was about prejudice, ownership, and a challenge to Caleb's quiet independence. It forced them to confront the reality of their situation, the danger their shared presence invited. It was a test of the tentative trust they had built, forcing them to choose, stand together against the storm, or retreat into their separate isolations. Neither spoke of parting. The choice, in that moment, felt already made. The stakes had been raised, pushing their hesitant connection toward something deeper, forged in the face of external threat. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the land. Inside the cabin, the single lamp cast long, dancing shadows. Caleb checked his rifle, cleaned his pistol. Sahara watched him, her expression unreadable. "You should leave," she said finally, her voice quiet. "This is my trouble. They target me." Caleb looked up from the rifle. "They target you because you're here. On my land. I gave you shelter. Now they've made it my trouble too." He met her gaze. "And even if they hadn't," he added, his voice softer, "I wouldn't let them just take you, run you off." Her eyes searched his, and in the depths of their silence she saw the truth of his words. It wasn't just obligation anymore, it was something else, something new and unexpected. "I know this land," Sahara said, shifting the topic, her mind already turning to the problem at hand. "Better than they do. If they come in the dark, they will follow the road or the wash. They are predictable." Caleb nodded, listening intently. Her knowledge was practical, invaluable. He had the weapons, the willingness to fight, but she had the understanding of the terrain, the experience of moving unseen. They spent the rest of the night talking, planning. Not like strangers anymore, but like partners facing a shared threat. She described the contours of the land around the cabin, the blind spots, the places where a small group could approach unseen, and the places where they would be exposed. He listened, his admiration for her knowledge growing with each word. They were a team, an unlikely one, but effective. The climactic confrontation arrived not at sunrise, as Brody had threatened, but in the pre-dawn darkness, just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. Brody and his men, perhaps emboldened by darkness and their own numbers, chose the element of surprise. But Caleb and Sahara were ready. They had moved the horses away from the cabin, extinguished the lamp early, and taken positions based on Sahara's understanding of their likely approach. Caleb was near the front door, rifle in hand, while Sahara was positioned near the back, closer to the wash, blending into the shadows. They heard them first, the creak of saddle leather, the muffled thud of hooves on soft earth, 3 riders, just as Brody had arrived the day before. They dismounted quietly some distance from the cabin and began to advance on foot, spreading out slightly. Caleb waited, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He could make out their shapes in the gloom. They were moving cautiously, expecting them to be asleep or caught unaware. When they were close enough to the cabin, about 20 yards out, Caleb rose from his crouch in the doorway, the rifle raised. "Hold it right there," he yelled, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I told you she was staying." The figures froze. Brody's voice, thick with surprise and anger, answered, "Calloway, you fool, we told you to get rid of her." "She's not going anywhere," Caleb replied, his stance wide, rooted to the ground. He was a wall protecting his home, and the woman within it. "Then you'll go with her," Brody roared, and lifted his own rifle. Before Brody could level his weapon, a movement flickered from the shadows near the back of the cabin. Sahara, silent as a ghost, had circled around, using the terrain as cover. She wasn't armed with a gun, but with a long, sturdy length of dried wood she had found, one end sharp from a break. She sprang from her hiding place not at the men, but at their horses tied loosely together. With swift, brutal efficiency, she struck the lead horse sharply across the flank. The startled animal reared with a loud whinny, pulling against the rope, tangling the other horses and creating instant chaos and noise. It was the diversion Caleb needed. As the men were momentarily distracted, trying to calm their spooked mounts, Caleb fired a single shot from his rifle, aiming deliberately high, into the air above them. The loud report echoed like thunder in the pre-dawn quiet, a sound that carried for miles. It wasn't meant to hit anyone, but to signal, to alarm, and to throw them off balance. "Get out," Caleb bellowed, levering another round into his rifle. "Get out and don't come back. The next one won't be high. Brody and his men were caught between the spooked horses and Caleb's clear threat. The noise, the unexpectedness of Sahara's action, the chilling finality in Caleb's voice, it broke their nerve. They were bullies, not hardened fighters, and the situation had turned against them. "This ain't over, Calloway," Brody shouted, scrambling towards his horse. "For tonight it is," Caleb said grimly. "And you come back, you'll find out it's over for good." Muttering curses and struggling with their tangled horses, the three men managed to remount, their earlier bravado replaced by a panicked desire to escape. They rode off quickly, heading back towards the town, leaving only the dust and the lingering smell of fear. Caleb stayed put, rifle still raised, until the sounds of their retreat had faded completely. Then, he lowered the weapon, his hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline. He looked towards the back of the cabin. Sahara emerged from the shadows, her face grim, her dark eyes reflecting the first pale light of dawn. She didn't say anything, just walked towards him, favoring her healing leg. When she reached him, she stopped, looking up at his face. He looked down at hers. In the dim light, he saw not just resilience, but something softer, something vulnerable. "You stayed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't run," he replied. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet affirmation of their choice. They had faced the threat together. They had defended their small piece of ground, and more importantly, they had defended each other. The external conflict, harsh and ugly as it was, had served to solidify their bond, revealing its unexpected strength. The climax wasn't a victory over external foes, but a declaration of their unity, a turning point that marked the end of their individual isolation and the beginning of a shared path. The dust settled slowly after Brody and his companions rode away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of the land. It was a silence weighted with the knowledge of the night's confrontation, but also a silence filled with a strange, fragile peace. They had faced the storm, and they had not broken. Caleb lowered his rifle and walked over to Sahara. Her expression was still serious, but the hard edge of wariness had softened. He reached out a hand, hesitant, and gently touched her arm. You were brave," he said, the words feeling inadequate. A faint smile touched her lips, a rare sight. "You were ready," she responded. In that simple exchange, in the quiet touch, was the culmination of weeks of shared silence, of cautious observation, of small kindnesses and growing reliance. The mistrust that had initially separated them had been replaced by something solid, something earned, mutual respect, deep understanding, and a burgeoning affection that had bloomed unexpectedly in the harsh soil of their solitude. They spent the morning assessing the damage, checking the horses, reinforcing their defenses. But their movements now were different. There was an ease between them, a comfortable proximity that hadn't existed before. They worked side by side, their actions synchronized, anticipating each other's needs without the need for words. They shared a pot of strong coffee as the sun rose fully, sitting together outside the cabin, watching the land awaken. The town might still harbor ill will, their names might be whispered with suspicion and condemnation, but that world felt distant now, its judgments less important. Their home wasn't just the cabin anymore, it was the space between them, the bond they had forged. Sahara's leg healed completely, but she did not speak of leaving again. Caleb did not suggest it. It was understood, a silent agreement reached in the shared crucible of fear and defense. Her skills with the land, her quiet strength, her deep connection to the natural world became woven into the fabric of his days. His steadiness, his quiet protection, his simple acceptance became the foundation of her new life. They were two solitary people, deemed outliers by their respective worlds, an Apache woman supposedly past her prime, a cowboy carrying the ghosts of his past. But here, in their small, isolated corner of the world, they found acceptance in each other's eyes. They built a life together, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with shared chores, quiet evenings under the stars, mutual support, and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts beating as one. The land remained harsh, demanding, but they faced it together. It was still a life of work, of facing challenges, but it was no longer a life of profound loneliness. Sahara found a home not defined by the whispers of her community, but by the quiet presence of the man who saw her worth. Caleb found a peace he had stopped searching for, a purpose in sharing his life and his land with the woman who had brought unexpected light into his long, solitary night. They had faced prejudice and hardship, the judgment of others, and the weight of their own pasts. But through resilience, through the unexpected gift of finding each other, they had carved out a new existence, a testament to the truth that home isn't a place, but a connection, and that love and belonging can bloom in the most unlikely of circumstances, defying age, defying race, defying the narrow expectations of the world around them. Their story was a quiet echo in the vastness of the frontier, a simple truth whispered on the wind, that everyone, no matter their past or what others say, deserves to find their perfect partner, their home in another soul.